Yes. So this morning, I woke up this morning, picked up my phone. First thing I saw was Fox News has an article by Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas. Why aren't we talking about the 400th anniversary of the Pilgrims? And I said, yes, we are cutting edge here. Cutting edge. Okay? Fox News should be interviewing us today. They should have reporters standing outside. This church is cutting edge. All right? We're right there on the front lines. I'm glad that we can have our conference. It was supposed to be during the summer, and it got pushed off, and yet we were able to do it. What a great weekend, too, to be able to do it here on Sunday before Thanksgiving, and just to be able to think about how God used these people in establishing our country in a right direction, at least initially, and all that they went through to do this. So I think you're going to enjoy the three sessions. Please judge them as a unit, as a group. I imagine if I were doing something like this, it would take a lot of time to get to my main points. They kind of come at the end. I'm guessing. I don't know. But I'm just telling you, I would encourage you to come to all three sessions if you can, and to really get a full picture of what's going on. Of course, it'll be available online as well. These are being live streamed, and it'll be available on our YouTube channel. So let's open in prayer, and then I'll introduce our speaker and we'll begin. Lord, thank you this morning that you have allowed us to be here in a free country where we can celebrate every Sunday the resurrection of our Savior freely and openly without fear of reprisal. And I thank you that we have an opportunity today to reflect upon really the foundations of a Thanksgiving holiday that is just in a few days. I pray that you would be with Dr. Priest and give him wisdom as he speaks today, and open our hearts to truth. In Jesus' name, amen. Dr. Priest is someone I met at a conference a couple of years ago. He was there. It's a Bible faculty summit, and we sat and had a meal. All the guys kind of sit around and eat together. And so we started eating and talking. And I said, I know I've heard of you. And so he was telling me his background. And he taught at Detroit Baptist Theological Seminary for a number of years. Do you all remember Mark Snowberger when he was here speaking about inspiration? Mark is from Detroit. We did that series with Paul Hartog and Mark Snowberger. Mark's from Detroit. That's where Dr. Priest was. In fact, Dr. Priest, you probably taught Mark in some classes. Yeah. So, and then he relocated to South Carolina to take care of aging in-laws, and in the process of that, taught at Bob Jones. And Joe had him for a class. So this is really nice that he is able to come today and be a part of this. He's pastored. He's doing some interim work just recently helping a church in Indiana for 5 weeks as they're looking for a pastor, and so has that pastoral side, and I think you're going to enjoy hearing from him today. So Dr. Priest, you come. Oh, and his wife Beverly is here. It's great to have you here today too, ma'am.
She's the high priestess. I suppose a lot of you came out of curiosity just to see what a priest looks like in a Baptist church. All right? Used to be a high priest, but I got tired of drugs. I've heard them all, so okay. We could spend a lot of time on nonsense, but we're here to look at history, one of my favorite topics, and we're going to be looking at the Pilgrims. Thank you for dimming the lights. Appreciate that so you can see this. Can you see the screen okay? All right. Most of us are not strangers to adversity, particularly with COVID around today. But severe trials were a way of life for the Pilgrims, beginning in England and then in their sojourn in Holland for 12 years, and then in their voyage across the mighty Atlantic, and then coming to America's shores. What is of paramount importance to us is the way they responded to them. We're going to be talking about the Pilgrims as a local church. That's what they were. They were a local church to a local church. They're going to be ministering to you as a local church. How did they behave in adversity? How do you behave in adversity? These Pilgrims were a noble Christian community. A simple folk, but a noble folk, of whom the world was not worthy, and by the world treated most shamefully. You retrace the steps of the Pilgrims. By the way, Dr. Beale and I took the first Mayflower tour out from Bob Jones University back in 1996. That dates us a little bit. We saw the shrines, the memorials, the monuments devoted to them in England and also in Holland. You retrace the steps of the Pilgrims. View the monuments, the shrines erected to their memory, and you are struck with the enormous obstacles these humble believers endured and the courage they displayed in overcoming them. And so a noble Christian community set in the context of the Protestant Reformation. Officially, the Reformation begins with Martin Luther, the 95 Theses, 1517, and ends with the Treaty of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War between Catholics and Protestants, 1648. So they fit within that time frame, and they're very much Protestants. They function, as I said, as a local congregation of believers. When they heard that strangers were going with them from England on the Mayflower, that made them very nervous because they were hopeful that they would go as a church, as a local church entirely, exclusively. But that didn't work out. What were they doing? They were seeking freedom to practice faith in the midst of adversity. You're going to hear me talking this session and the next two frequently about freedom and faith. Those were the watchwords of the Pilgrims. And they're ours as Americans, as Christians living in America. Freedom and faith. And they go hand in hand, don't they? And it's a history focusing on providence and praise. Those are two other words you're going to be hearing from the Pilgrims. We're going to be quoting William Bradford frequently. He wrote the first history of America, Plymouth Plantation, focusing on the colony of Plymouth. And he uses those terms frequently, providence and praise, or thanksgiving. And so that's what we're going to be focusing on in these sessions. Today, we'll be looking at the Pilgrim background in England. And then in the next service, the morning service, we're going to be looking at their situation in Holland. And then we're going to be looking at their voyage and their early settlement this evening. Be sure to come back this evening because we're going to be focusing on their legacy, what they have left us as Christians. Now, the Pilgrim story actually begins with King Henry VIII and his divorce, not from his wives in this context, but of the church from Roman Catholicism in 1534 with the Act of Supremacy. Henry VIII retained all the ceremonies and doctrines and so forth of the church. The only thing that really changed was who was head of the church. Before it was the Pope, now it's the monarch. And subsequent monarchs followed suit with the Act of Supremacy. In other words, the monarch was the head of the church. And so to be disobedient in any way to the church meant you're disobedient to the king. And that looms large with the Pilgrims a little later. His son, Edward VI, and that's of course what he desired. He went through many wives in order to get that son. Edward VI, son of Jane Seymour. And he had regents in charge of him because he had not come to maturity. He had to be 18 before he could rule on his own. But he had Protestant regents. And there's every indication that Edward VI was a born-again Christian. How do I think that? Well, don't know that for sure, but we look at the correspondence that he had between himself and others, like John Calvin. Calvin really encouraged Edward VI to maintain a good testimony, and he did. He really established Protestantism as the religion of England during his very brief reign. He died of an illness at age 15, so he didn't last very long. But his stepsister, Mary, came to the throne and changed everything. She was a dyed-in-the-wool Roman Catholic. And so she changed England back to Roman Catholicism. And in order to do that, to make England truly Roman Catholic, she began persecuting Protestant ministers. And she put 300 of them to death in just terrible ways. But many of them fled, like John Knox, who ministered in England for a while before he went to Scotland under the reign of Elizabeth I. But he fled to Geneva, which was a place for a lot of Protestant refugees. And there, of course, John Calvin was ministering, setting up the Protestant Reformation in that area. And John Knox was responsible for helping to get published, he didn't translate it, but published the Geneva Bible, which was the favorite Bible of the Pilgrims. If you go to Old Plymouth, in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and looked at that reconstructed village, and you talked to the players acting out the different passengers of the Mayflower, you talk to them and ask them, what's your favorite? I asked one of them, I asked Mrs. Bradford, do you use the King James Bible? Oh, no, we don't use the King James Bible. We use the Geneva Bible. That was their favorite Bible, mainly because of the footnotes in it. They were all Protestant. King James didn't like that at all, as we'll see. But anyway, don't want to get down a rabbit trail. We got time we don't want to waste time. Elizabeth introduced the Elizabethan settlement, combining elements of Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. So it was a compromise deal. She liked aspects of Protestantism. She liked certain parts of their doctrine. In fact, she introduced the Book of Common Prayer and the 39 articles. Actually, they were longer than that, eventually pared down to 39, and they were basically Protestant. But she liked the ceremonies, the pomp and circumstance, and all of that of Catholicism. Well, toward the end of her reign, a movement came into play called Puritanism. The Puritans wanted to stay in the Anglican Church and clean it up, purify it, get rid of what they called the rags of popery. We don't want vestments. We don't want kneeling at the altar. When you come into this church, what is the focal point of this church? What's the focal point? What is meant to be the focal point? Anybody tell me? The pulpit. Right on. Exactly. The pulpit. The Word of God. And if you have a table up front, and many Baptist churches do, it's not an altar, it's a table. If we could, at communion, we'd all gather around it and have communion together, but it's a table. It's not an altar. But in a liturgical church, like an Episcopal, Anglican church, a Roman Catholic church, the focal point is the altar. Why? Because they believe in sacraments. It's a sacramental church. We don't as Baptists. We believe the elements are ordinances, not sacraments. It's a very important distinction. So the Puritans wanted a complete reform of the church. So Elizabeth started persecuting them, putting many of them to death, unfortunately. Now the separatists came out of the Puritan movement. They agreed with the Puritans theologically, but they wanted a complete separation from what they thought was an apostate church. I mean, the Anglican church, it's not going to separate from Catholicism, not sufficiently for them and their doctrines. They didn't agree with their doctrines. And they didn't agree with the idea you had to use this Book of Common Prayer and all these ceremonies. We want a Bible-centered church. We want to hear the Bible preached, just like you do. Right. Well, the separatist movement got its start in London. Can you see that circle? The red circle? Great. They got their start in London. And then from there, They went to East Anglia, particularly the town of Norwich. And here is where Robert Brown started his ministry. He was in the priesthood, left it, became something of a radical separatist. Not all the separatists agreed with him, the Pilgrims didn't, but he set the stage for separatism throughout England. And in fact, many separatists were called Brownists out of derision. And the main point of focus for us is the Midlands, around Lincolnshire, Northamptonshire, so forth. This is our focal point right here, the Midlands. Now, when Elizabeth died in 1603, never had any children, she was the Virgin Queen, and look around for a monarch to replace her. So they looked to Scotland because the King of Scotland, James VI, had Tudor blood, so he could qualify to succeed Elizabeth. So they asked him to be their king. So he became king. James VI became James I of England. Now, James was coming from a predominantly Presbyterian, Protestant Scotland. Oh, that encouraged the Puritans big time. Finally, we got a Protestant king on the throne now, a true Protestant, and we can go to him and get all these reforms in place. So they set up a meeting at Hampton Court Palace, beautiful palace. You ever get to London, be sure to go to Hampton Court. And set up a meeting there with the Puritans. This was 1604. They brought with them their millenary petition, 1,000 signatures by prominent Puritan pastors throughout the realm, listing their reforms, what they'd like to see changed. Get rid of the vestments, get rid of all the ceremonies, focus on the Bible, allow us churches to have a say-so of who pastors us. Instead of imposing pastors on us, we'll choose our own pastors, things like that. Well, this was Hampton Court, 1604. Well, how did James react to this? So James the First and the Puritan reaction. Absolute conformity to the Anglican Church was his response. What? Their mouths dropped. What? Yeah. I will make them conform themselves or else harry them, force them out of the land. Monarchy agreeth as well with Puritanism as God with the devil. We're not going to have Puritanism. We're back to point one with Elizabeth, or worse than that, maybe Mary. So that's not what they wanted to hear. So the Puritans and Separatists rejected Anglican courts, these ecclesiastical courts, canons, which are ecclesiastical or church laws. They're not something you fire out on the lawn. And ceremonies, all these ceremonies. These are popish trash, the Puritans said, relics of the man of sin. We don't want those things. But James insisted we're going to retain them. So a series of regulations were passed, making unauthorized worship a criminal act. And William Bradford wrote in his Plymouth Plantation, we were hunted and persecuted on every side. Godly people, middle-class citizens, folks like yourselves, hardworking people, the backbone of the nation, but hunted and brought to trial, put in prison, whipped like these poor people are, fined, enormous fines, some of them executed. What were they doing? They were simply affirming that Jesus Christ was head of the church, not the King of England. Some people get in their heads, oh, I'm I'm the governor, or I'm the president, or I'm this and that, and I'm head of the church. No. Jesus Christ is head of the church. Folks, we should never, never forget that. Jesus Christ is head of the church. Your pastor is an under shepherd. The chief shepherd is Christ. He knows that. We should never forget that. And their instruction from worship, therefore, should come right from the book, from not the Book of Common Prayer, but the Bible. Therefore, they determined that whatever the cost, and it cost them greatly, they would meet to worship God according to the dictates of the Bible, not the King of England. In spite of careful precautions, worship services would be infiltrated by government spies. One such agent described a separatist church service. During the meeting, he said, one is appointed to keep the door, to watch the door, to warn of any intrusion. They, the worshipers, do not flock together, but come 2 or 3 at a time. And many may be admitted, and all being gathered together, the man teaches a man appointed to teach stands in the midst of the room, and his audience gather about him. He prayeth about the space of half an hour. Longest prayer I think I've ever heard is in the Metropolitan Tabernacle in London with Peter Masters. 15 minutes. Half an hour they pray. And part of this prayer is that those which came thither to scoff and laugh, God would be pleased to turn their hearts. So while this agent is sitting here, he's being prayed for right while he's there, see? Isn't that neat? And, and then they split up and go out, a few at a time. But his last words were this. This was their testimony. Rather than turn, they will burn, whatever the cost. We're not going to sacrifice our worship. Now, the separatist movement in the Midlands, in Middle England, revolved around 3 cities, 3 towns. And the first town here is, if I can read it, Babworth, Gainsborough, and Scrooby. These are called the Holy Triangle. Dr. Beale refers to it as the Holy Triangle. Other historians do, because this was the center of separatism in England. And again, most of the people that attended these churches, simple, common folks, farmers, many of them farmers, artisans, craftsmen, whatever, and just wanting to come and worship God. William Bradford was an orphan. His parents died when he was very young, went to live with uncles. And he would walk from his home in Austerfield 10 miles to this church in Babworth just to hear the Word of God preached. There was an Anglican church very close to him, but at a very early age. He was just 12 years of age. He'd gotten a hold of a Bible, he read it, was saved. Clifton, that was the pastor, Richard Clifton, he said later, had done much good and under God had been the means of the conversion of many. His uncle said, look, you're taking a big risk going to that church. Then when Richard Clifton was deposed because of his preaching, what did he do? He went to Scrooby, just up the road. This was closer to William Bradford's home. So he joined the church at Scrooby. He wanted to continue to hear Richard Clifton preach. They warned him again, you better be careful. You'll be arrested, taken to jail. This was his response. Kids, Listen to this response. This is from a 12-year-old. I'm not only willing to part with everything that is dear to me in this world for this cause, but I'm also thankful that God has given me a heart to do it and will accept me to suffer for him. Wow. That's powerful. William Bradford would go on to become a leader among the Pilgrims and governor for 30 years. He was so revered, so honored, they would keep electing him governor year after year after year of the Plymouth colony in New England. So, Bradford, that's his statue in Plymouth, author of Plymouth Plantation. Now, the center of their worship became Scrooby. The pastor of the church at Gainsborough was John Smith, and he left to go to Holland, and he was the father of the Baptists. He started a Baptist church in 1609 in Amsterdam, and so that took off as a separate group of people. They went to Holland and did their own thing. But what we call the Pilgrim Church started at Scrooby. Clifton came from Babworth to Scrooby and preached there. And it was in the home of William Brewster. William Brewster was, I would say, he would be like the mayor of the town, had a pretty high position, bailiff, postmaster at Scrooby. The Separatist church met in his home. He was chosen elder of the church, a position that he maintained in the Plymouth congregation until his death in 1644. So Richard Clifton and a new pastor that they received, John Robinson, went with them to Holland, but they never made it to America. Brewster did go with them to America. He was their spiritual leader all of his life. Now, the pastor who joined Clifton at Scrooby, John Robinson, was also a very godly man. And like Clifton, they were very well educated. So was Brewster, by the way. They went to Cambridge University. Cambridge was the citadel of Puritanism. And so those that wanted to really imbibe Puritanism, that's the school they went to. Robinson went there. And when they finally came to Holland, he became the sole pastor of the congregation there in 1608. Now, James I had only contempt for the Separatists. He had all kinds of names for them. They're an evil sort. They're pests in the church. And he was all the time trying to find ways through his bishops and archbishops to persecute them. But again, their watchwords were freedom and faith. Freedom and faith. But they're between a rock and a hard place, this Scrooby local church congregation. They're not going to give up their worship, okay? They're not going to give up their worship. So what do? Stay here and continue to face persecution, possibly dissolution? You know, our leaders might be eliminated. What do? Well, they decided to leave England and go to the freest place at that time in Europe, Holland. Holland had signed a peace treaty with Spain. They'd been through a terrible war with Spain, so let's go sign a peace treaty, and that allowed refugees to come to Holland and worship God any way they want as long as they kept the peace. Okay, that's close by. We'll make arrangements to do that. So these professors, that means these believers, whose hearts the Lord touched with heavenly zeal for his truth, shook off this yoke of anti-Christian bondage, and as the Lord's people joined themselves by a covenant to the Lord into a church estate in the fellowship of the gospel to walk in all his ways made known according to the best endeavors, whatsoever it should cost them, the Lord assisting them. These are words from their church covenant. And what were they attempting to do? break asunder the chains of unrighteousness, the bonds of Antichrist, and planting our feet in those pleasant paths of the Lord, walking in the light and liberty which Christ hath dearly purchased for us. The Church of England had made its choice to depart from the Lord. As Titus 1:16 says, they profess that they know God, but in works they deny him, being abominable and disobedient unto every good work, reprobate. That was their estimate of the Anglican Church. Okay, that's what they were hearing, but what are we going to do now? Well, the catalyst for their final decision came from Tobias Matthew, Archbishop of York. He had ecclesiastical authority over Scrooby, and he knew about them. He'd heard about them, and he determined to punish these sect of troublemakers. And that was the sign now for them to make preparations to leave. And so in the spring of 1607, I know this map isn't very good, it's the best one I could find, they decided to leave from Scrooby, sell their belongings, their homes, make their way to Old Boston. Don't confuse this with Boston, Massachusetts. This is Old Boston, okay? And they had made all the arrangements. They got to Boston to meet the ship, and it was a British captain, and evidently he was in cahoots with the authorities, because as soon as the Pilgrims got there, the authorities came and arrested them all. Arrested them. Monument was erected to this near this place in September 1607. Those later known as the Pilgrim Fathers were thwarted in their first attempt to sail to find religious freedom across the seas. So what to do with these men, women, and children? They were taken from one magistrate to another. Finally, he put the leaders in jail in the Boston Guildhall, which is today a museum in Old Boston. They were imprisoned in cells hardly bigger than your walk-in closet. 6 weeks. Bradford, Brewster, Robinson, they were incarcerated in this jail. And finally, with a fine, they were released to go back to their families. Now, let me just say just a quick word in addition to the Guildhall, the jail there. Old Boston is also the place of the largest parish, Anglican parish church in England. It's called by nickname the Boston Stump, St. Botolph's Church, the Boston Stump. 270-foot tower, the Boston Stump. Go into that church, and you will find a stained glass window, interesting stained glass window inside of this Anglican church. This is of John Cotton and some of his church members waving goodbye to the flagship Arbella in 1630. John Winthrop is aboard that ship. He and 8 other ships are on their way to New England to found Boston in 1630. That's the beginning of the Puritan movement in America. Again, the Plymouth Church starts 10 years earlier in 1620. The Pilgrims are separatists. The Puritans are nonconformists. John Cotton, the whole 12 years, he came in 1612. He left in 1633. So do the math. He was there that long. And during that time, he didn't want to separate the church. So he came 5 years after the Pilgrims were incarcerated there in Boston. But anyway, He's waving goodbye. 3 years later, 1633, he has to go into hiding. He says, I can't handle this. They wanted him in Boston to pastor the church, so he and many of his parishioners went with him. Anne Bradstreet, Simon Bradstreet, her husband was eventual governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony. Her dad was governor of Massachusetts Bay. John Cotton was the premier pastor of that community in Boston. Anyway, that's a sideline. Made a second attempt to depart in 1608. And again from Scrooby, they somehow had to sell more possessions, do whatever they could to scrounge up the money. They were not going to be defeated. The courage of these people, the tenacity of them, the determination, it's incredible. See, these are the kinds of qualities that were passed on to future generations in America. See, these are the people that laid the foundations of a democratic America. These are the people. These are our spiritual ancestors, if you please. So they decide to try one more time. This time, we're going to hire a Dutch captain. Yeah. We're going to hire a Dutch captain. So they did. And we're going to go in a couple of different groups. The women and children, along with a few men to protect them. They'll come one direction, and then the rest of the men, they'll come another, so as not to call a lot of attention to themselves. And they went to the area of Immingham, and just across this hole where they would actually set sail and come to Holland. But the poor men which were got aboard were in great distress for their wives and children, when they thus saw to be taken and were left destitute of their helps. What happened? The Dutch captain got antsy. When the men got on board the ship to go to Holland, they couldn't find the women and children. What happened? They got stuck in mud because the tide went out. They were still way up the coast in the mud. They couldn't get to their husbands and all. So, and the men were looking for them. And the captain just got, no, we got to get out of here. So here they are sailing away. And pitiful it was, Bradford writes later, to see the heavy case of these poor women in this distress, what weeping and crying on every side, some for their husbands that were carried away in the ship, others not knowing what should become of them, and their little ones who were hanging about them, crying and quaking from the cold. This is an artist's rendition of what went on. You imagine that. You're a wife. You see your husband. You've got your little one with you. You see your husband going away, sailing away across to Holland. Well, what happened? Well, eventually, one way or another way, they all made it over there. The authorities took them, didn't know what to do with a bunch of ladies and kids. They had to let them go. So they eventually made it over there to join with their husbands. An adventure almost desperate. This is Amsterdam. This is the place where they dwelt for a short time. And let me just read this in closing this morning, and we'll come to this section you're looking at right now. Being thus constrained to leave their native soil and country, their lands and livings, and all their friends and familiar acquaintance. Everything and everyone they had known all their lives, near and dear to them. It was much, and thought marvelous by many. Why are you doing this? Marvelous by many. But to go into a country they knew not but by hearsay, where they must learn a new language, Dutch, and get their livings they knew not how. These folks were farmers. They're coming into a city. How are we going to live? It being a place subject to the miseries of war, Spain could attack at any time again. It was by many thought an adventure almost desperate, a case intolerable and a misery worse than death. But here it is. This is how Bradford closes this section. But these things did not dismay them. Though they sometimes did trouble them. I mean, we admit that, yeah. For their desires were set on the ways of God and to enjoy His ordinances, His worship. But they rested on His providence and knew whom they had believed. The right slide here. They confessed. And this is where we get the word pilgrim. They confessed they were strangers and exiles, pilgrims on the earth, and desired a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He had prepared a city for them. That's what they were. See, that's what a pilgrim is. That's what a Christian pilgrim is. He's looking for the city whose builder and maker is God. We're simply on a journey to that, like Christian and Pilgrim's Progress. We're on a journey to the celestial city. And on the way, we're going to run into troubles and trials and difficulties. But we're going to react to them as though we are citizens of that heavenly city. And so, folks, let us reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worth to be compared with the glory that shall be revealed in us. They read that. That was in their Bible just like it's in our Bible. Okay? All right, I'm 4 minutes early. Any questions? Comments? For a Baptist preacher to be early in a service, hey, I could see the pastor down here was excited about that. All right, no questions, comments. Feel free to ask me anything while I'm here. I can always answer, I don't know, but I'll try and find out. Okay.
Good. Excellent. All right, let's close in prayer. Let's pray, and then we'll take our break and then be back at 10:30 for our morning service. Lord, I thank you for these people who set an example for us of what it means to be a pilgrim, to leave family and friends behind for the very purpose of having a place where they could worship you freely. I do thank you that they made this journey because they set in motion events that would lead for us now to have freedoms that we enjoy. And we owe them really an eternal debt that can't be paid. But we thank you for them. Help us to learn from their example. Let their church be a lesson